I would like to tell you about an experience, writes James C. Dobson, that my wife Shirley and I had while visiting the cultural centers of Europe about 20 years ago. He says, one of the cities we toured was Berlin, Germany. I have been fascinated since I was a child with World War II and what made the adults around me so fearful, writes James Dobson. I have wondered how educated and intelligent Germans could have been so corrupted and deceived by the propaganda that laid the foundation for tyranny. It is still difficult to comprehend how so many Christian churches, with their good people, fell prey to the lies screamed by Adolf Hitler and his evil cohorts. Even before he released his murderous intentions, they stood with their arms and hands extended, cheering rapidly for a man who was to become one of the most ruthless dictators in world history. I searched for an understanding of the processes that led to torchlight parades, book burning, racial hatred, and mass killings of Jews, gypsies, Poles, homosexuals, disabled, and mentally ill people. He writes, while most Germans didn't know about the extermination camps, the majority favored Hitler's preparations for war. Many books have been written on that subject, but I needed to see it for myself. I found an explanation, at least partially, on the streets of Berlin. One morning, I took a walkabout tour of the important buildings and sites from the Nazi era. First, we stood outside Hermann Göring's headquarters. He was second in command after Hitler. Then we walked past Goebbels' propaganda ministry, from which he spread manufactured lies and fake news during the 1930s and 40s. We then stopped outside Gestapo headquarters, where so many people were tortured and murdered for daring to oppose the regime. The tour ended at the parking lot that now sits over the bunkers where Hitler spent his last days and eventually committed suicide with his wife of less than 40 hours, Eva Braun. The tour lasted 2 hours, during which I learned how the Nazis managed to enslave the German people and then molded them into a force that devastated and conquered almost every country in Europe and threatened large portions of Western civilization. The professor who had led our group told us that the Nazi success was made possible by one primary factor: their complete and utter control of the means of communication. Radio was highly effective in those days, as were newspapers, films, speeches, books, and magazines, posters, rallies, and yes, public schools and universities. Every word spoken in Germany was scrutinized, and those who rejected Nazi lies publicly were often murdered or sent to concentration camps from which most people did not return. Terror was the stock and trade of the Gestapo. It was a common occurrence for secret police to knock on the doors of anyone who didn't conform to the party line. An offender would be dragged outside and shot as a warning sign of what would happen if others got out of line. Even children were urged to report the activities and private conversations of their parents who talked at home about their opposition to the gangsters in government. They were tortured or murdered too. What a ghastly period in human history. Speaking of children, one of the most wretched elements of the dictatorship was the complete domination of public schools. Parents had no influence on how their boys and girls were educated. In fact, all schools became training centers for Nazi propaganda, and there was no option to opt out. The boys were prepared for war, and girls in their mid-teens were actually sent to camps where they were expected to get pregnant from being around boys in immoral ways, due to the fact that they were not married. Babies born out of wedlock from these encounters became wards of the state to replace men likely to be killed in battle. So basically they were breeding farms of humans. Disgusting. Here's how Adolf Hitler viewed public schools. He said, "Your child belongs to us already. What are you? You will pass on. Your descendants, however, now stand in the new camp. In a short time they will know nothing but this new community." Later, as war approached, he said, "This new Reich will give its youth to no one." You can almost hear the evil laughter after that. Why am I recalling these bitter memories? Writes James Dobson. This historical account is relevant today because America and other Western nations have for decades been losing their God-given rights that define us as a free people. We are not experiencing Nazi-like tyranny yet, but we are steadily being expected to think, speak, write, and act in a prescribed manner in conformity with what is now called political correctness. The mainstream media has become a tool to influence elections and spread this belief system. Sadly, the rights handed down to us by our forefathers more than 200 years ago are gradually being overridden, ignored, contradicted, or disregarded by the courts and legislators. We are less free now than we were even 5 years ago. At this time, this article was written, of course, We are in the storm where Donald Trump is using his military influence to win over the Republic again from the damage done by the deep state over the course of roughly 150 years, more specifically 60 years, definitely since 2000 and 2008 to 2016. The principles on which Americans' freedom was built are spelled out in the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. They are called the Bill of Rights. The first among them addresses the most important guarantee. It promises religious liberty and includes these words: Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Despite what you may have heard, nothing within the Constitution mentions the separation of church and state. In fact, that last part actually says nothing shall prohibit it. Despite what you may have heard, nothing, that the second part says here, you shall not prohibit the free exercise thereof of religion. So to say that we must separate church and state in the way that they mean, which is to separate church from state, is completely unconstitutional. The Constitution was not an atheist document. It was a document to prevent the Catholic takeover that was so dominant in Europe. To paraphrase the First Amendment, it not only offers an ironclad guarantee that we will enjoy freedom of religion, but also promises freedom of speech and a free press, protects the rights of the people to assemble peacefully, and to petition the government when citizens are aggrieved. These rights are fundamental for a liberated people. The other 9 amendments within the Bill of Rights enumerate additional assurances to the people that their government will have restricted authority over them. Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist Paper 84 that the Constitution tells Congress what limited powers it has to make law, and the Bill of Rights reiterates to Congress what powers it does not have to infringe on our rights. Reflecting this affirmation, Abraham Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address that ours is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. These assurances are precious to us today, but I thank God for the dedicated men who inspired and fought for them. We dare not let officious justices, judges, legislators, or politicians even take one of them away from us. But some liberals today are diligently trying to do just that. We must stop them. But how? Our rights are being trampled every day. One key way to defend our liberties is at the ballot box. Unfortunately, more than half of Americans, including the majority of Christians, don't even bother to vote. Shame on them all. Don't they know that tyranny for us and our children is only one generation or even one election away? We must vote to elect leaders who will defend what has been purchased with the blood of patriots who died to protect our liberty. We owe it to the memory of their sacrifice to preserve what they did for us. We must not fritter it away on our watch. If any politician tells you he will fundamentally change this nation, what he means is that he plans to undermine our Constitution and take away our heritage of freedom. Run from him or her. In my lifetime, I have witnessed the steady erosion of the principles that made this country great. Here are a few examples of what the judiciary has done or attempted to do in this great land of the free. Writes James Dobson. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California has done more to unhinge liberty than any other court. In 2015, for example, it upheld an outrageous legislative measure that forced pro-life clinics, which are dedicated to the sanctity of human life, to promote abortions with their patients and to place posters on the walls telling them where they can go to kill their babies. That became the law of the land in 9 western states for 32 months. Thanks to President Trump's nomination and the Senate's subsequent confirmation of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, that ruling was overturned this past June 2018 by a vote of 5-4. How close the court came to decimating freedom of speech in those clinics, though. So many other critical issues related to the Bill of Rights have been decided by a single vote. In Obergefell versus Hodges, 2015, the Supreme Court redefined marriage as it had been protected in law and celebrated internationally for more than 5,000 years. That decision was 5-4, and it eliminated the exclusivity of marriage between a man and a woman in 31 states. Let me describe that ruling in another way. The laws protecting traditional marriage in 31 states were summarily invalidated. The citizens in those 31 states had recently gone to their polling places and voted to define marriage as being exclusively between one man and one woman. By a single vote, an imperious unelected justice and 4 colleagues on the Supreme Court overrode the will of the people and swept away collective decisions of the populace. These 5 justices imposed a cultural disaster on America. Some court watchers say it was tantamount to the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, because it helped to undermine the institution of marriage. The family will never be the same. Lincoln's words at Gettysburg became hollow. Whatever happened to the promise that ours is a government of and by and for the people? What hubris those justices demonstrated with their votes. In one of the most outrageous assaults on parental rights in American history, children attending Mesquite Elementary School in Palmdale, California, came home one afternoon and told their parents what had happened to them in class. One of their teachers, with administrative approval, sat for hours with students aged 7 to 10 to ensure that each of them completed 79 items of a questionnaire. The kids, barely out of babyhood, were required to respond to highly personal questions about their private thoughts, including 10 items about their sexuality. Permission was neither requested nor discussed with parents. The children were asked about such topics as frequency of thinking about being immoral and thinking about touching other people's private areas, among many others. The parents filed suit in both federal and district courts against the school district for invading their children's privacy and the parents' rights to control the upbringing of their own children, and for invading the thoughts of children and setting them up on a very bad path. They were desperately trying to defend the innocence of their children, but to no avail. The courts ruled that there is no fundamental right of parents to be the exclusive provider of information regarding sexuality or education of their children. Both the district and federal courts dismissed the case. One court asserted their parents have no right to determine what their sons and daughters will be exposed to while enrolled in California's public schools. While the parents appealed their case, it went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California. The judges upheld the lower court ruling in favor of the school district and concluded that education is not merely about teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. Education, they said, serves higher civil and social functions, including the rearing of children into healthy and responsible adults. In other words, parents, get lost. What a tragedy. I can envision the founding fathers rolling in their graves, and if they were alive today, thinking, is this what we fought the American Revolution for? Time and space will not permit me to cite similar horrendous rulings from unelected and imperious judges, but I am excited to end with some encouraging news, writes James Dobson. For the first time since the courts began to run things in the 1960s, the judiciary is changing dramatically. Some good things are starting to happen. So far, President Donald Trump has nominated 44 judges who have been confirmed to the bench, and there are many others in the pipeline. There is hope for additional conservative and common sense decisions to be handed down in the future. This is a matter for sincere prayer among those of us who have longed for relief from judicial tyranny. We must all join together to defend righteousness and family values on the home front. This can be a lonely vigil unless defenders of the Constitution, and particularly conservative Christians, will stand shoulder to shoulder with us in this struggle. So will you help in this journey and be a modern day patriot for your family and all of America as you can?